Good morning and welcome to US Signal's Recovery Roast event, where we will discover the perfect blend of cybersecurity and coffee. We look forward to bringing you today's very exciting event brought to you by US Signal and featuring our friends from White Knight Labs and Littlefoot Coffee Roasters. In this morning's webinar, US Signal will be unlocking the secret to MXDR and MDR, giving you insightful knowledge about the importance of implementing these services to protect your business today. Nick and White Knight Labs will be providing a demo of the product as well. After the conversation and demo, Littlefoot Coffee will take us all through the roasting experience of US Signal's one-of-a-kind coffee, the Recovery Roast, as well as a Chemex brewing demonstration. At the end of this webinar, one lucky attendee will win a Chemex coffee bundle, which includes a Chemex coffee maker, US Signal Hydro Flask mug, and of course, a large bag of the Recovery Roast coffee. We will also be hosting a Q&A with all of our webinar presenters, so please place your questions during the webinar in the Q&A chat box below, and we will get to those at the end. I am your moderator today, Lauren Pratt, Channel Marketing and Events Manager here at US Signal. And I would like to pass it over to your speaker today, Nick Defoe, Director of Information Security at US Signal. Nick?
Hey, Lauren, thanks for the introduction. Appreciate it. I also want to thank our partners here who have helped us with this demo, White Knight Labs. So you may not have heard of them before. They're a adversary emulation company. They specialize in doing red teaming, and they're former colleagues of mine. So John Steigerwalt and Greg Hatcher used to work with me at a former employer, and we've got a lot of respect for what they do and how they do it. So if you need penetration testing, adversary emulation, and so on, those types of red teaming services or assessments, they'd be a great company to potentially work with. So thank you to them for serving as our tamed red teamers and enabling us through this demo as we're going to proceed with today. So just a kind of high-level overview of what we're going to walk through. First of all, I'm going to talk through what are US Signal's managed detection and response service offerings. So we've got MDR and we've got managed XDR. What are those two different services? How do they work together? And why you might want them for your business. Then we're going to jump into what do those underlying technology platforms that we use for those services look like, and just give you a high-level tour of each of those services. And then we'll get to the fun part, the important part. And that's where we're going to have our friends at White Knight Labs serve as an adversary and demonstrate using these technologies what it looks like to come under attack from a threat actor. And to do that, we're going to follow a real-world example of a threat that happened to a business or an attack that happened to a business, and execute some of the exact same tools, tactics, and procedures that the threat actor used to attack this business, and show how our services can help you defend your organization against that type of real-world attack. So that's really the goal. We want to use these services to protect our customers, and we're going to show you how that works in a practical way by looking at behind the scenes what that looks like for us and our SOC team as we respond to those events. So thank you for joining us today, and we're going to dive into a brief overview of what those services look like next.
All right, so thank you for joining our demo today. But before I actually get to the demo part of the demo, I have one slide. The one slide here is to help understand an overview of our products that we offer in the managed security space. And that's just because we use some naming conventions here that map to specific products, and understanding what we're talking about when we say MDR or managed XDR will help you as we go through this demo to understand that MDR, for example, is the Sentinel One platform, and so on. The key thing here is that each of these products that we have combines a industry-leading detection and response platform, a technology platform, with this US Signal Security Operations Center, serving as the 24/7 response mechanism. So the idea is we're using industry-leading tools with a trained team of experts, and by combining those two things, we are the ones that are catching those alerts, and you get to sleep through the night if there's a false positive. And we do a lot of catching false positives because that's just the nature of security tools. So specifically when we're talking about MDR in US signal parlance, that means that's our endpoint-based EDR-backed product. We use the Sentinel One EDR platform for that product when we're offering it to customers. And the US Signal Security Operations team responding to those alerts. So the Sentinel One platform includes 9 different detection engines, including some artificial intelligence, machine learning based tooling, and the endpoint agents for Sentinel One support Windows, Linux, Mac, and some legacy platforms. So that's a kind of unique feature of Sentinel One. They do support agents back to Windows Server 2003. And other endpoint protection platforms don't necessarily have that backwards compatibility. Now, the feature set is a little bit more limited in some of those older agent versions due to the nature of them being legacy platforms, but they are available, and that's better than a lot of platforms can do. And further, there's one key thing that we rely on as the security operations team here at US Signal to make good use of the Sentinel One platform, and that's the deep visibility data that it collects. So deep visibility is all the process level, network level, it can track registry level pieces of data that just provides a very rich picture of what is happening on all of the endpoints that are being monitored by the Sentinel One platform. And we use that data to correlate with alerts that are generated by Sentinel One. And when we have both managed XDR and MDR in the environment, we very frequently are using the deep visibility data to help us investigate alerts that are coming in from the managed XDR platform. We view them as kind of two different sides of the same coin, and we'll come back to that in a minute here. All right, moving on to discuss the managed XDR side of the house here. It helps to understand before we dive into this, what do we mean by XDR? So XDR stands for Extended Detection and Response. And XDR is a term that came kind of after EDR, where EDR was endpoint detection and response. XDR, the idea is it's bringing in more data sources than just endpoint to create a more holistic picture of what's going on in your environment outside of just the endpoints. So for our managed XDR platform, we selected Rapid7 Insight IDR, which is a SIEM/XDR platform that has endpoint agents to collect endpoint logs, but also includes all kinds of other log sources. Those can be cloud log services like Office 365, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform. It can also be on-premises log sources or on-network log sources like your firewall and VPN, which are very critical log sources. And most importantly, in a lot of environments, Active Directory. Active Directory provides a whole bunch of useful data when we're talking about what is happening from an authentication and privilege access perspective in most networks. So the Rapid7 platform integrates all this data from all these different log sources to understand what's happening in the environment, and then has a few different rule set capabilities for how it generates alerts. So attacker behavior analytics, for example, maps to what you commonly view as, traditional signature-based alerting. These would be things like known bad hashes in the environment, bad behavior where a specific type of Windows system is being abused and launching a piece of malware. Those types of things fall under attacker behavior analytics, but user behavior analytics is a more advanced method of doing baselining in the environment to understand what is normal and what is abnormal, and then it alerts on the things that are not normal for your environment. So for example, a user that logs in from 2 different countries simultaneously, a user that logs in from an unusual country for the first time, a user that all of a sudden is connecting to a bunch of systems that they've never connected to before, and that could potentially mean somebody is trying to move laterally in the environment. And lastly, there's a lot of threat intelligence-based alerting baked into the platform as well. Rapid7 has an entire threat intelligence team that not only ingests normal things like from a threat intelligence perspective, like IOCs, domain names, IP addresses, but they also build new detection rules based on activity that they've seen in the wild during their investigation and response activities. Lastly, there's a couple optional pieces that you can deploy as a part of this platform. That includes deception technology, which would be honeypots and a few other techniques such as honey hashes that imitate a admin on your systems and then do some detection when that admin account is used. And you can also deploy network traffic analysis tooling that can take a more advanced look at your network than may be provided by those basic VPN logs. So when we have customers that are using both managed XDR and MDR in the environment, they're looking at different things, but they're very complementary. There is some overlap between the managed XDR and MDR platforms in terms of the data they ingest, but there isn't necessarily a reason to only have one or the other. It's not enough overlap that they are duplicate. It's that they're very complementary in terms of the picture that they provide into your environment and the ability to investigate what's going on in your network. Now, the big thing that we offer beyond just the technology platforms is the US Signal Security Operations Center. So our team of experts here has been trained on these vendor platforms, and we are advanced users of these tools. We use them to conduct our 24/7 response and monitor the environment so that when something is detected that is abnormal and not benign behavior, we help you perform intrusion analysis to understand what happened, where this originated from, and so on. We also help you implement the platform in your environment and perform tuning and eliminate those false positives as they come up. Lastly, using all of the data that is collected by the platform, our team is able to perform proactive threat hunting so that when a new threat is discovered, for example, a recent vulnerability that's well known is in the paper cut print management software, we can investigate based on the knowledge of that new vulnerability to see whether that has been exploited in your environment based on the data that's collected by these tools. So without further ado, it's time to move into the actual demo and show you what these tools look like and how they work. Jumping into the Sentinel One Console, there's a few things that are worth noting before we start the tour. Firstly is that this is a demo and lab environment, so there are a few things that are different than what we would normally see in a live production environment. We feel like this is enough to give you a good taste of what this is like in here, but because there's not very many systems, it's a little bit sparse data-wise, but you can still kind of understand what's going on. So hopping over here, this is the first section that you'll see when you log in, and this is the dashboard page. Generally provides some idea that there are a few threats that are active in the environment. Here's the types of threats that are detected, as well as the threats by type. And if you come down here a little bit further, you get some kind of meta information about the environment that we're protecting. So agent versions, connection status, unpatched devices, what operating systems, so on and so forth, do you have here. Next thing that's worth discussing is the organization of the environment, and that's what we have on the left side here. And this is a good representation of how we like to organize customer environments. So each customer environment gets what is called a site, which is this top level container in Sentinel One, and then within that site we have a number of groups. So per best practices that we follow here at US Signal, we create a group for the domain controllers specifically because they require some specific exclusions that are recommended by Sentinel One. We also create sites for servers, workstations, and in some cases, beta groups, which we use to deliver updates to the Sentinel One agent ahead of other parts of the environment so that we can test them out before we push that agent version out to the whole environment. Groups are just a structure for organizing what's going on in the environment so that we can fine tune and control certain aspects of how the agent is working and potentially even treat different groups differently, applying more scrutiny to certain groups, so on and so forth. Hopping over to the next section I would like to show you is the Sentinels Screen. So the Sentinels Screen has an inventory of the agents that are in your environment. So we currently have 5 different systems, and you can at a glance get an idea of what we're seeing here. Because, for example, this red icon here indicates that there is active infection on that endpoint. The gray here indicates that that endpoint is not currently connected to the management console. And when we click on one of these systems, you get the endpoint pop-up that gives you details about the system that you're looking at. So for example, in this endpoint, you can see that we've got 2 gigabytes of memory, 2 CPU cores. You can see the IP address of the system. You can see the external IP address of the system and various other statistics that can be interesting or relevant. Another note here is that you also get an application inventory. In this case, there isn't much installed on this system. If we go to a different one, you get more systems that are, or applications that are installed. Another thing that can be very useful is the last logged in user is shown. The next section I would like to show you is the policy tab. So this is one area where our demo environment is set up differently than we would have a production environment. That's because we currently have this set up to detect only mode, which means that we're only detecting threats. We're not going to stop or block threats. We want to do that here so that we could make our demo show you how the environment would respond both for the MDR service as well as the managed XDR service, because if we just block the threat by the MDR service, you can't necessarily see anything from the XDR service. So we like to set these to protect and protect mode in production environments. On the right are the different engines that are running for the Sentinel One agent, and these engines are the different types of detections that the platform can generate from the Sentinel One side. Lots of information here in the agent, not specifically very interesting, except we do want to make sure that we have anti-tamper enabled that protects the agent from getting taken offline by attackers. And lastly, we come down here to the deep visibility section, and this is very interesting because this shows you the different types of data that's collected by the Sentinel One agent. So things like DNS logs, registry keys, IP address information, different files that are executed, written to disk, so on and so forth, and even URLs that are browsed in the web browser on the system, because that can be very important. If your user clicks on a phishing email that takes them to a web page, you want to know what the URL was that they visited, and that's not always available via your networking logs on your firewall, for example. So next thing I want to do is pivot to show you what that deep visibility data can look like. So switching over here to another tab, you can create very advanced queries using deep visibility data. And this is the screen where you do it. The query language is relatively easy to understand, but our team of experts here can generally handle that side of it for you. So switching over to a query, this query for destination IP exists is going to show you all network connections in the last hour inside the environment. And in this case, Sentinel One is actually reporting on itself. So we have Sentinel One Ranger over here is the executable that's making connections, and you can see the whole command line that is executed. And here's even more details about that specific thing. It was talking from this IP address to this IP address on port 445, and the connection did not succeed. So deep visibility provides you very granular detail about what's happening in the environment. Now it's time to move on to the managed XDR overview. To start off our managed XDR demo, we're here in the Rapid7 console, starting again from the home screen or dashboard screen, depending on how you look at it. So the home screen in managed XDR shows you a number of details about event ingest, which is up at the top here, ongoing investigations, and then this map can be pretty interesting if you've got logins that are failing from various parts of the world. A bit more detail down here. One other thing that I want to point out before we move on here is that the search in Rapid7 is very interesting because you can type a username into the search or an IP address or a host name, and if that is a known thing to the system, you'll be able to jump right into details about that specific username, host, or IP and get a whole lot of really good information. So you can see, for example, that this user B Banner has logged into the host PL dev client 01, and various other information like, there's Cobalt Strike that's associated with this user account. So we're going to hop back over and take a look at our data collection for a minute before we move on to other sections of the platform. Data collection in Rapid7 works by setting up a collector, which serves as the collector on the network for event data. And that collector then has event sources address or a host name, and if that is a known thing to the system, you'll be able to jump right into details about that specific username, host, or IP and get a whole lot of really good information. So you can see, for example, that this user B Banner has logged into the host PL dev client 01, and various other information like, there's Cobalt Strike that's associated with this user account. So we're going to hop back over and take a look at our data collection for a minute before we move on to other sections of the platform. Data collection in Rapid7 works by setting up a collector, which serves as the collector on the network for event data. And that collector then has event sources associated with it. So this is the collector that's active in our lab right now, and the event sources are over here, including things like this Palo Alto Networks firewall and VPN that are feeding data to this collector. And beyond that, there's also agents that are feeding data in and a few other data sources. Next, we're going to move on to log search. Log search in Rapid7 gives you the ability to query and sift through the log data that's collected by the platform. they break down logs into different types of buckets depending on the type of data that the logs include. And in this case, we're looking at DNS logs. So the data here can be displayed a number of different ways. For example, a table view is available, or this JSON view that we're looking at here. And you've got various advanced tools to be able to analyze and look through this data. So for example, let's say we want to look for what are the different endpoints that have been queried over the last 20 minutes. You can open up this log entry, look at the query here, and add a group by to the query key to the query, and run the search again. And then we've got a much nicer view to kind of get an overview of what are the different things we're seeing from this environment right now. So we've got a number of Rapid7 endpoints, we've got GitHub, we've got internal lookups to the internal domain, and so on and so forth. This can be very handy when we're looking at the data after an investigation has been triggered to determine what has happened inside your environment. Without further ado, we're going to actually move into how do these platforms actually protect you when an attack has happened. And for that, we need to take a look at, well, what does an attack actually mean? What does that look like? Before we get to the coffee roasting, we're going to talk about a different kind of roasting, Kerber roasting. Just kidding, we're not going to make it there in this demo because we don't have time. But Kerber roasting is an attacker technique that was a part of this attack that we're going to look at a little bit here. So we wanted to demonstrate in a real environment, a real type of attack to see what our tooling would provide protection and detection wise, right? So where did we find how to emulate a real attack? Well, we use this website called the DIFR report. The DIFR report, Digital Forensics and Incident Response, is what DIFR stands for if you didn't know that, provides real life attack information from the forensic perspective so that defenders can learn from what attackers are doing to better protect networks and systems that we're all monitoring. So this incident occurred back last year, and it's called Bumblebee Roasts Its Way to Domain Admin. And this is what we wanted to use as a script for our friends at White Knight Labs to follow, so that they can emulate this attacker in our environment and we can see how our tooling will respond to what they do. So in this website, we've got an overview of the overall timeline of this attack from day 1 all the way down to day 11, when the attack apparently was stopped by the incident responders in this situation. And this attack starts out with an initial access via a ISO file that has a .lnk file that executes a payload, and that payload then runs a Cobalt Strike beacon, and that Cobalt Strike beacon is used to start enumerating the domain and then take further steps from there. So we wanted to show from the perspective of Sentinel One and Rapid7, what does this attack look like, and that's where we're going to go from here. This timeline most likely started with a user getting a phishing email that prompted them to download this ISO file. The ISO files are commonly used to deliver malicious payloads because end users don't often expect or even know what an ISO is and don't expect it to be something malicious. So in this case, it's an invoice report is how they labeled it, which includes a document.lnk file. So what does it look like when the user gets this file on their system and tries to open it? The user just gets this ISO invoice report, which has the document in it, and they want to get their document, so they run it. That file pops up the command prompt, but it just hides it again right away. What actually happened here? Well, this malicious payload, wab.exe, was downloaded and run on their system. From the Sentinel One perspective, this is what it looks like when that ISO file and then the included document file is double-clicked by the user. You can actually get a fairly full understanding of what happened. Now keep in mind, this threat was not mitigated or blocked by Sentinel One because we're running in detect-only mode for purposes of this demo. So you can see right here, this run DLL32 command very closely matches what we saw in the defer report example right here. So we're closely emulating this threat. Now you can tell from the threat indicators on the side here that a suspicious command prompt was run from a .lnk file. That's a very good indicator that something has kicked off because of this phishing scenario. And all of these other indicators on the right here contribute to the fact that there's something fairly malicious going on. Sentinel One would have blocked this threat and stopped it immediately if it was in protect mode, but because again we're in a demo here, we allowed it to execute so we could get the telemetry and move on to see what happens from the Rapid7 side. From the Rapid7 perspective, we've got a lot of telemetry coming in as well, even from this initial access step of the attack chain. So the first detection that was kicked off is this suspicious process run DLL32exe with no arguments spawns process. And you see this coming up repeatedly in the timeline. So another unique feature about Rapid7 IDR is it will link related, potentially related, and so on detections into one investigation so you can get a good idea of the overall timeline you're looking at here. When you're looking at the timeline view, you can open up the evidence of a specific instance and see a lot of detail, including the logs of what specifically happened. So in this case, we've got CMD running, and it's running without standard arguments, which CMD and run DLL32 are commonly abused by attackers using living off the land techniques to try to stay under the radar of detections. And so this is a common thing to see when adversaries are trying to avoid getting detected in environments. So the initial step has been detected by Sentinel One, would have been blocked by Sentinel One, and also been detected by the Rapid7 IDR platform. So let's move on and see what happens in the next stages of this attack. So after the initial access into the environment, the attacker has successfully run their Cobalt Strike beacon, which means they now have remote access to the system that the user ran the executable on. So what does the attacker do next with access to that system? They use the Cobalt Strike beacon to run some basic enumeration commands that help them understand what they have access to and how it lives in the environment. So what does that look like from their perspective? Let's take a look. Here's the attacker enumerating the enterprise admins in the environment, as well as the domain admins. Now this is a really interesting thing that is very common on intrusions, and fortunately, Rapid7 has a detection for that. Looking here at the next detection in the timeline, we've got enumerating domain or enterprise admins with the net command. We take a look here at the evidence, we can see that the B banner user ran the command net group domain admins. Now, this seems like a really simple thing, a really simple detection, but it's very, very common. And in fact, we have seen this in the wild on customer networks recently, and we're able to use this as an opportunity to stop an attack at the first touch of the internal network. The attackers do this so that they can identify who the domain admins are, and they can target those accounts for further attacks to move laterally and escalate privileges. So what happens in the next stage of the attack? The attacker moves laterally with remote desktop. We can detect that as well in certain circumstances, but we'll skip over it for now because we are lacking for time. They run AnyDesk as a remote access application. And next they come to run af.exe, which is an AD-find application that is used to further enumerate the environment. And guess what? Rapid7 has a detection for that as well. Here we've got domain discovery with AD-find. And again, in the logs, you can see that the user bbanner executed AD-find to enumerate parts of the Windows domain. So after the initial access, if that was not blocked by something like Sentinel One, within the first few minutes of an intrusion, there are at least 2 or 3 more opportunities for Rapid7 to detect and our response activity to block that activity in the network and evict the intruders before they can do something further malicious like deploy ransomware. I believe that's all the time we have for our demo today, so I am going to turn it back over to our team and they will run you through the next parts of this webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Please continue to tune in as we turn it over to Littlefoot Coffee Roasters, where they will be going through a roasting demo of the recovery roast and a crash course on how to brew through Chemex. And if you stay till the very end, you will have a chance to win your own Chemex coffee bundle.
Welcome to Littlefoot's Roastery. So this is our vintage German roaster. It's a Probot built in 1996. This is a drum roaster. There are 2 main types of roasters. There's a fluid bed roaster or an air roaster that is a lot like a popcorn popper. Our roaster is a drum roaster. So essentially what that means, it's very similar to your dryer at home. There's going to be a drum tumbling the contents of it with a row of burners underneath creating a heat source, and then a fan pulling hot air through that drum. It's a very basic, simple machine. Even ours here is much more roast about feel. We don't have any software hooked up to it. We roast based on feel and sense of the coffee, and this vintage machine is perfect for how we like to roast coffee. So today we're roasting the Peruvian coffee. Is a component of the recovery roast for US Signal. And the idea behind roasting is we're taking a raw green coffee product and we're turning it into a roasted product that is capable of brewing and extraction. So the roasting process is about a 10 to 14 minute process depending on the style of roast and the beans used. The first 4 minutes of this roasting process is just about drying out the coffee itself. The coffee arrives to us with about 11% moisture content still in the bean, dried that way at the farm. For stability and travel purposes, they have to leave some of the moisture into the coffee. Therefore, the beginning of the roasting process is all about high heat and full gas. Generally takes about 3 to 4 minutes to dry the coffee out. And then we'll start to get into the actual roasting of the coffee. So once you dry the coffee out, it's a pretty boring stage of the roast. It's just watching green coffee slowly dry, kind of like watching water boil. You're just kind of waiting around. So once the coffee is dry, then we're using that heat that we're using to dry the coffee to build up the energy inside of the coffee. So we're taking all of the natural ingredients of that coffee, fats, sugars, acids, and we're going to break those down using heat and create more complex, more unique chains. The idea behind it is we want to highlight all the flavors, the natural characteristics of the coffees from the origin level and make them extractable through a brew method, whatever brew method you choose, so it's a pleasant cup of coffee in the end. So once that roasting process starts, we're building up energy through all these processes, the chemical processes happening in the coffee. We'll come up to a stage which is the most crucial stage for roasting for as far as paying attention and where things can crucially go wrong. It's called first crack. You may be able to hear the popcorn popping sounds in the drum. If you can hear the popcorn popping sounds, so it's just like you're heating up a kernel of popcorn. It's gonna pop open. So basically you're pushing energy into the coffee, it's absorbing it. So much energy gets built up, and then we're going to reach that first crack stage. At first crack is actually a release of energy. So I will remove some of my heat just before that process starts to allow that to be much more of a softer, subtle crack so we don't get any burning or issues there. And then we'll use that energy that the coffee is now giving us to roast the rest of the coffee. So from first crack on, generally that's a short phase. A lot happens in that phase, but it's about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes, depending on the roast profile you're going for. For this coffee in particular, it's going to be a bit shorter. We're looking to highlight this coffee has malic acidity like apples and pears, as well as a nice caramely chocolate sweetness. So we're just looking to develop just enough of that to make it a nice, round, smooth cup of coffee in the end. For this roast, we are avoiding second crack. We want to keep those flavors intact and extract them through our brew method and allowing it to be a much more balanced, smooth coffee. A lot of times with second crack and darker roast, you'll get a bitter astringency that is not pleasant. So we tend to like to roast our coffees a little bit on the lighter side and avoid second crack. So for the roasting process, first crack will go for about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. Once you drop the coffee out of the drum into the cooling tray where you'll see the arms spinning, that is essentially the end of the roasting process, but there is a cooling fan pulling air down through that coffee as well as while it's turning to stop the roasting process. Because like when you cook meat or anything else, when you take it off the grill, that extra heat will allow it to continue to cook. So cooling it down in a quick time is crucial for accuracy of your roast. Generally, it takes, depending on the temperature of the warehouse, it can take about 3 to 4 minutes to cool down. Obviously, in the winter, it's much faster. In the summer, it can take a little bit longer. But that is essentially the end of the roasting process. Once it's cooled, we'll release it into these buckets. Since this is just the Peruvian coffee, this will get blended in with our Brazil and used to make the recovery roast blend. Rosie's going to be doing a Chemex demo for you. It's kind of a perfect hand-in-hand with this blend. It's the most balanced brew method alongside some of the most balanced coffees we have in this blend.
Hello, I'm Rosie, one of the co-founders of Littlefoot Coffee.
And I'm Alex, also one of the co-founders of Littlefoot Coffee.
And welcome to our warehouse. So we got started in 2017 in Chicago. I worked in the coffee industry as a cafe owner in Humboldt Park, Chicago.
And I worked for Intelligentsia roasting coffee in Chicago as well.
So both of us originally are from Michigan, and we always had this dream of one day opening a coffee roastery in our home state. So in 2017, we were lucky enough to get started working at nights at Alex's job, kind of roasting coffee for my cafe. And then we kind of grew our wholesale from there. It wasn't until 2019 that we finally made our way back to Michigan. And we opened just outside of Grand Rapids in Granville in August of 2019. And we work with a number of coffee shops, restaurants, and some grocers as well. And then we also love doing collaborations with other businesses in the area, such as US Signal. Today, we are going to be demoing a pour-over brew method. There are a number of wonderful brew methods, but today we're going to be using our Chemex here. This is a beautiful vessel. It was actually invented in 1941 by a chemist. So it's definitely sturdy. It kind of feels like that laboratory glass. And he created it to really bring out the best in coffee in terms of the extraction and the oils. So the shape is on purpose. It's actually on permanent display in the MoMA. So a lot of little history with the Chemex itself. This is the brew method that we use here.
I use at home as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's just a wonderful way to really taste the natural flavors in the coffee. With the filter itself, it extracts a lot of oil. So today with our demo, we're going to be doing a pour over using the recovery roast.
So this roast is a special blend we did with US Signal. It's a South American blend of Brazil and Peru. The flavor notes we put on here are caramel, chocolate, and pear. Just a very smooth, balanced roast, which goes well with this brew method, actually.
Yeah. So just before we get started with the actual process, we can kind of do an overview on equipment. It doesn't really have to be that involved. We have our own electric kettle and pouring kettle. You can also use just a kettle from home. So what you're going to want to do to start is we'll get our kettle going here. We're going to bring it up to a boil, and then the ideal temperature for the Chemex is going to be right off of a boil. So we'll let that get going. The thing about pour overs is that it very much comes down to the ratio of water and coffee. So unlike a batch brew coffee maker at home where it's precise enough, but it's more of a quantity, these are really based on the quality of the extraction. So you can really nerd out on the precise ratios and extractions. Really, our recommendation is a 1:16 ratio. So what that means is 1 gram of coffee to 16 grams of water. So we got started with 25 grams of the recovery roast today. The grind size that we recommend is a little coarser than a medium auto drip. So whatever grind setting you use for your coffee maker at home, you're going to want to go a little bit coarser for that. The other thing with a Chemex, if you have one or you've used one in the past, a lot of times they have a paper filter, which is awesome. That is a pretty thick triple filter paper that you can use to put into the vessel itself. But here, because we use it so often, and just to kind of save on resources, we purchased one of these metal filters that is equipped for the Chemex itself. So it's really designed to kind of act the same way as the paper filter, but just definitely reusable, which is great. So we're gonna let that water boil there. Scale is definitely recommended for pour over, just to make sure you're getting that ratio that we discussed. So this is pretty inexpensive scale. You can use any kitchen scale that you have at home. Doesn't have to be too fancy. Just want to make sure it has those units of grams. So as I mentioned, you can definitely use a tea kettle at home and boil that right on the stove. We just use a kettle and pouring vessel in-house. It's a little easier and a little bit more direct. So with a pour over, you're going to want water just off of the boil. So we'll just let that cool even for just a second. And then we're going to pour that directly into our metal kettle here. And 1:16 ratio, since we have 25 grams of coffee, that means that our output is going to be 400 grams of water. So once you grind your coffee, you can pour it directly into the filter itself. If you are using a paper filter, it's kind of nice just to give it a little bit of a rinse first and then pour that water out. That just takes away any of that paper taste that you might get with the Chemex. Since we have our metal filter though, what we can do is pour directly into it. So we're going to take our coffee. One nice thing to do is even that out a little bit. And then you're going to want to tear the scale back to 0. You can do a little divot in the middle. That just kind of helps create a nice flow as you're pouring. And the first pour, our goal here is to double the weight of coffee with the water. So to start, we're going to pour directly into the middle. You're going to make clockwise movements here. And just a little over 50 grams of water in there. That just saturates the grounds to start. And this process is called the bloom. So what this is doing, it's releasing a lot of the gases. You can see the bubbles start to come up there. And that process takes about 30 to 45 seconds. So you're going to also see a roast demo, and the bubbles are also kind of that gas that's still in the coffee itself being released. You'll see Alex take you through that roast demo, but that's going to be why those bubbles are coming up. So now that the bloom has kind of saturated the beans, we've released some of those gases, the next step is you're going to just pour no bigger than like a $50 size right in the middle. Just like even, slow flow is great. You don't have to go super fast. And it will filter. I know the first few times I did this, I was so afraid it would overflow, but if you have a nice steady stream, it's gonna filter for you. And then our goal here, as I mentioned, is 400 grams of water. So we're just gonna do that nice, even circular pour until we hit that 400. All right, we're at 401, so that's pretty close. That's a good time to stop. We really like the Chemex because it just brings out so many of the natural flavors in the coffee. I think it's your favorite pour over, Alex?
Yeah, it's my favorite. I think it's the most balanced brew method that we use as far as like a smooth, rich body of the coffee, but extracting a lot of the flavors as well.
And as you see on our bags, we have those flavor notes. Unlike some flavored coffee, we actually never add any additional oils or chemicals or anything like that. Those are actually just the natural essence of the coffee that comes out in the roasting process. So those notes on the side are what we taste when we brew the coffee, and you may taste something similar, even a little different. It's kind of fun. Part of the fun of tasting coffee is to really pull out what you're tasting. So once the water has completely filtered through the filter here, you're going to want to remove it. What you're looking for too is kind of a nice even bed on the bottom of the filter. So we're going to take that out. You can see even on the sides too, some of that oil, which has been extracted. So you can just tap that on the side gently, put it into a cup, and then with a Chemex, giving it a nice little swirl, kind of just mixes up the coffee, starts a nice little flow. And then the spout here is wonderful. You can pour directly from that right into your cup, your mug. And it's super beautiful color that the Chemex creates, almost like a tea-like at times, because it's extracted so many of those wonderful oils. So we're gonna drink some recovery roast. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks for joining us on our tour and our demo of a Chemex brew for y'all. Enjoy your recovery roast. I know we are enjoying it right now.
Definitely. And if you'd like to check us out, check out our socials, and then you can also head to littlefootcoffee.com. We have a variety of seasonal coffees that you can purchase directly from us. And if you're local to Grand Rapids area, you can even come to our warehouse and pick it up directly. So thanks for joining us, and hope you enjoyed. Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. Thank you so much to Nick, White Knight Labs, and Rosie and Alex at Littlefoot Coffee Roasters for today's demonstrations. We're now going into the live Q&A portion of today's webinar, and we'll open up the floor for questions. If you haven't already, go ahead and use the question mark Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit those questions, and we'll go ahead and get started. Nick, we had a few questions that came in already for you, so we'll just kind of jump right into that. The first question is, what are the issues that companies can face if they do not have an MDR, MXDR solution in place?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and there's a lot of companies out there that may have something like a legacy antivirus, something like a Symantec or something like that still in place, and they've had it forever. They kind of trust it, or have been lulled into thinking that it's enough. But the reality is, with modern attackers who are able to go from an initial infection on a network to deploying ransomware in as short as we've seen like 4 hours on some of those reports from that website, the Differ report, you really have to have tooling that is able to catch attacks early and potentially stop them or block them early. But if not, if you can't detect, stop, or block them at the very beginning of the attack, you need the team that is watching a tool and able to catch things later down the road as they're attempting to move laterally in your environment. And then the tooling that you have needs to support a response capability. So then you can have, a trained team of people that can step in to stop an attack if the tool isn't going to do that all for you, right? So, what we see out there is a lot of customers that do have, legacy platforms, or they might even have a XDR or MDR platform, but they don't necessarily have the expertise to run it themselves. They may have it misconfigured. We've unfortunately seen that with one of our non-security customers, a customer that only had backups with US Signal this year, where they thought they had EDR platform that was going to prevent, something like ransomware, and it just wasn't turned on the right way, and they ended up having a lengthy recovery process going through backups as a result. So, there's a lot of things that can come into it. You've got to have a decent enough tool, and you've got to have people that know how to use it to really stay ahead of the attackers right now.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have a question in here for you, Alex. What kind of water is best to use for taste? Tap water, bottled water, lower high pH balance, softened water? What do you recommend?
That's a great question. Usually we use filtered water here. We have a filtration system here. I understand everybody doesn't have like filtered water at home. It's kind of hard to do. Honestly, if you just use like a Brita filter, like a standard carbon filter with your water, that's usually the best way to do it for in-home use. Lower pH, mid to lower pH is definitely better for coffee. That was one thing. pH and alkalinity here were a little bit high, so that's why we got our filtration system. But you can also buy a product called Third Wave Water, which is essentially, if you really want to nerd out on coffee, it's exactly the minerals that are designed for the best way to brew coffee. And if you just buy like distilled water with nothing in it and add that packet into it, that'll give you essentially specialty coffee's perfect water balance. But yeah, for people at home, Brita filter, carbon filter is perfectly fine. That's the best way to get clean water and good water for coffee.
Perfect. Thank you. Back to you, Nick. This question actually came in while you were on our MXDR platform for the demo. Would this automatically isolate the computer if there was a known infection?
So both the MDR platform, Sentinel One, and the XDR platform, Rapid7, have capabilities to isolate endpoints on the network so that they can only talk to those given platforms and essentially prevent the spread of infection. Sentinel One and the MDR service does have the capability to take that action in an automated way. It does it's not always on for every system. It's kind of a customer preference thing. And even then, we might recommend that you configure that automatic isolation capability for only your user workstations and not your servers, or a subset of your servers and not things like your domain controllers, so that you don't take offline something that's going to essentially put you in a worse situation than if you left it online and let it get infected. But those are opt-in features. You don't have to have those. Some customers want to use them and some don't use them. And yes, it can automatically isolate them with the MDR Sentinel One powered service.
Great, thank you. Back to you, Alex. Do you have any recommendations on how to start roasting small batch coffee in your home?
That's a good question. So there are a few providers of green coffee in small batches that you can order from online. You can actually buy pretty cheap, affordable coffee roasters for home that are just little electric burners with a drum that rotates with a little fan on it. There's no really wrong way to get into roasting at home. You can just start with a cast iron skillet. A lot of people do that just to see what happens as the coffee is roasting. But there's there's definitely some cheaper options out there for home roasting. But yeah, my recommendation is just to dive into it. If you can afford to buy yourself a little roaster, do it. If not, then just start with the popcorn poppers. Also, people convert those because the old school popcorn poppers, it's essentially just hot air, and that's really all you need to roast coffee. So and definitely feel free to reach out to us on those socials and things that were shared. If you have any more questions, I can give you more specific recommendations for machines to look into as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. One more question here, Alex. Does placing beans in the freezer, whole bean, ruin the coffee bean, or does it extend the produce prior to grinding? Someone has heard both sides of the story and wants to confirm.
This is a great question. Yeah, a classic coffee question. So putting the coffee in the freezer doesn't necessarily help either way. The main thing is keeping oxygen away from your coffee. So keeping it in an airtight sealed container. and keeping it out of direct sunlight. Those are the two things to keep your coffee as fresh as possible. Also, grinding when you brew will help keep that coffee fresher longer. But yeah, no, freezing your coffee doesn't ruin your coffee, but it also doesn't help your coffee in any way. There's just no need to do it.
Perfect. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
Back to you, Nick. From a vigilance standpoint, what do you recommend as a way to increase user ability to recognize potential threats?
Yeah, that's always a good idea to stay on top of as well. User education is one way that you can definitely stop threats before they even touch any of your systems, right? Because if a user doesn't click a link in an email, you don't get an infection that way. There's a lot of debate over whether things like actually performing phishing assessments against your staff, sending them phishing tests actually works. So I'm not going to specifically recommend that. It's really something that every organization has to consider, the pros and cons for their own organization. And so I don't say outright go do phishing assessments against your team, but there are a lot of good resources out there that can do fairly affordable user awareness training specifically. And some of those newer companies in that space really do a good job at making the training videos that they provide interesting and kind of fun. I don't really recommend a specific brand in these situations either, but go search for user awareness training. There's a number of them available. Find one that you can test out and watch their videos to see if you can stomach it. And if it's something that isn't really tedious to watch, that's a good place to start.
Wonderful. Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions today. If we did not get a chance to get to your question, feel free, for Nick's questions, feel free to just email marketing@ussignal.com, and we will make sure to get those questions over to Nick and reach out to you directly. And then, as Alex mentioned, if you have additional coffee questions for Littlefoot, go ahead and follow them on their social accounts and send them a message there, and they will get right back to you. So before we log off today, I just wanted to quickly announce our Chemex giveaway winner. So Matthew Collins, if you're still on the webinar, congratulations, you are the winner of our Chemex coffee bundle today. You will be receiving that in the mail to the address that you used at registration. If you have any questions, feel free again to reach out to us at marketing@ussignal.com. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you again to our panelists and to all of our attendees today for your time. Enjoy the rest of your morning. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone.